I'm Sophia, 28F, and for as long as I can remember, my family has treated me like I'm nothing more than a clueless airhead. It never mattered that I worked hard, that I was independent, or that I had built something of my own. In their eyes, I would always be the dumb little sister who didn't understand how the real world worked. Meanwhile, my older brother, Ethan, 32M, was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong, despite being lazy, reckless, and entitled. My grandfather built our family business from the ground up, intending it to be a lasting legacy. But over the years, my parents took control, eventually handing the reins to Ethan. Under his reckless leadership, the company became a personal piggy bank rather than the empire it was meant to be. Every bad decision they made, every irresponsible financial move, was swept under the rug because, in their eyes, money would always be there. The business could never fail, at least, that's what they believed. I wasn't even considered part of the equation. I put myself through college on a scholarship, got a good job, and built my own investments on the side. I wasn't living a flashy life, but I was financially stable. My family, however, assumed I was struggling because I wasn't constantly flaunting wealth like Ethan. To them, the fact that I wasn't obsessed with appearances meant I was barely getting by. Ethan, on the other hand, was given everything. He never worked a real job outside of our family business. He spent money like it was infinite, constantly taking out loans under the assumption that our parents would cover him. Expensive cars, luxury vacations, overpriced watches, he lived like he was royalty. I knew the business was struggling, even if no one wanted to admit it. Suppliers weren't being paid on time, employees were quitting over missed paychecks, and there were whispers that banks had started denying loan applications. But if I brought it up, I was dismissed. You wouldn't understand, my dad would say. Business is complicated. Then I found out something that made my stomach drop. My parents had rewritten their will. Nearly everything, our childhood home, the company, the remaining assets, was going to Ethan. They had made their decision a long time ago. Ethan would inherit it all, while I was expected to fend for myself. Their reasoning: Sophia wouldn't know what to do with it anyway. It was almost laughable. They thought I was too clueless to handle money while Ethan was bleeding the company dry. I stopped trying to argue. Instead, I let them believe what they wanted. I acted uninterested in the business, like I had no clue how finances worked. I nodded along when they spoke down to me, let them believe I was just some naive little girl with no ambition. And while they were busy underestimating me, I started gathering information. What they didn't know was that I had been making my own investments for years. I had built a strong portfolio, grown my savings, and positioned myself in a way that I didn't need their money. While they assumed I was struggling, I was actually in a better financial position than any of them. Then, a friend of mine who worked in finance confirmed my suspicions. The business was on the verge of collapse. Ethan had taken out massive loans under the company's name, defaulted on several payments, and had multiple pending lawsuits. The only reason it hadn't completely crumbled was that my parents were still desperately throwing money at the problem, hoping it would fix itself. But the banks had finally caught on. Ethan was getting rejected for loans left and right. The business was too risky, his personal credit was destroyed, and even private investors wanted nothing to do with him. That's when my parents started making little comments, not outright asking for money, because that would mean admitting they needed my help, but hinting at it. My mom mentioned how family supports each other. My dad talked about unexpected struggles and how it was important to stick together during tough times. Ethan, of course, didn't say a word. He was still operating under the belief that everything would work out for him in the end. Then, my parents hit me with a bombshell. They weren't just struggling, they were desperate. They finally admitted that they needed financial help. But instead of asking nicely, instead of acknowledging that they had dismissed me for years, they made it sound like an obligation, like it was my duty to step in and hand over my savings to fix their mess. It wasn't even a request. It was an expectation. That's when I made my decision. I wasn't going to refuse outright. No, that would be too easy. If I said no now, they'd just keep trying to manipulate me. They'd guilt trip, pressure, and make me the villain for abandoning family. Instead, I played dumb. I acted hesitant, like I wasn't sure how finances worked. I told them I needed time to figure things out, that I wanted to understand what was going on before I committed to anything. They bought it immediately. Ethan even laughed, telling me not to stress myself too much over the complicated business stuff. I smiled, nodded, and pretended to be the naive little sister they always saw me as. But behind the scenes, I was already setting my revenge in motion. I agreed to help, but with a catch. Ethan and my parents were eager, assuming I'd just hand over money without asking questions. Instead, I told them I wanted to understand how the business works before investing. I acted unsure, saying things like, I don't know much about finance, but if I'm putting my savings into this, I should probably learn, right? Ethan barely held in a laugh. He actually found it funny. Sure, why not? He said, waving me off like I was a child playing pretend. My parents looked relieved, thinking I was finally trusting them with my future. They handed over the company's financial records, not expecting me to actually go through them. I was supposed to skim, nod along, and then hand over my money like a good little sister. Instead, I spent hours reviewing everything. The mess was even worse than I had imagined. There were massive debts, some dating back years. Suppliers hadn't been paid on time. Multiple lawsuits were pending from vendors who had been strung along with false promises. Ethan had taken out massive loans using the business as collateral, assuming the company would always make enough money to cover them. He wasn't just burning through money, he was gambling with it, assuming he'd win every time. I kept my face blank when I returned the documents. Wow, I said, sounding impressed. I had no idea running a business was so complicated. You guys are amazing for handling all of this. Ethan smirked, eating up the fake praise. My parents looked proud, like they had finally gotten me to see the hard work they put in. What they didn't know was that I had already found a way in. There was a legal loophole, small but powerful. Decades ago, my grandfather had issued shares to early investors, some of whom had long since passed away or moved on without claiming ownership. The records were buried in outdated company filings, overlooked because my family had never expected anyone to dig into them. Through a series of discrete transactions and shell companies, I gradually acquired control over these forgotten shares, increasing my stake without raising suspicion. My family had never considered this possibility because, In their minds, I wasn't interested in business. They assumed I'd never look into ownership. But with each share I acquired, I gained more control. To strategize my next moves, I reached out to Daniel, a forensic accountant specializing in corporate fraud. He had spent years uncovering financial mismanagement for major firms, and I knew if anyone could help me expose Ethan's mess, it was him. I framed my inquiry as a simple investment question, but I knew he would dig deeper. He reviewed the numbers and immediately warned me. The company wasn't just struggling, it was one bad decision away from total collapse. The debt was deeper than what had been reported. And worst of all, Ethan had been forging documents to make the business appear more profitable than it was. Investors had been misled. If anyone looked too closely, everything would fall apart. Ethan had built a house of cards and was acting like it was indestructible. Meanwhile, he continued his reckless spending. He bought a new car, claiming it was an investment in his image. He took another vacation, posting pictures in luxury resorts. I watched silently as he dug himself deeper. As I deliberated over my investment, my parents started pushing harder. At first, they framed it as a small contribution to help the family. But within days, it turned into pressure to cover major expenses: the mortgage, payroll, Ethan's business trips. They assumed I wouldn't question it. I played along. I told them I was interested in investing, but I wanted to sit down and discuss terms first. I framed it like I was just trying to be responsible, like I needed reassurance that everything was secure before making such a big move. They jumped at the chance. Ethan and my parents scheduled a meeting, clearly convinced they were about to manipulate me into handing over my money. Ethan looked smug. My parents looked relieved. They thought they had won. Then Daniel dropped another bombshell. Buried in the financial documents, he found something even worse. My parents had signed a contract using their house as collateral for one of Ethan's loans. There had been multiple late payment warnings from the bank, letters, emails, even calls they had ignored, believing Ethan would fix things at the last minute like he always did. But this time, the bank had run out of patience. The foreclosure process had already begun. Ethan was on a sinking ship, and my parents were tied to it. Quietly, I started reaching out to remaining investors, asking neutral questions about the company's future. I didn't say much, but I didn't have to. The numbers were already making them nervous. Ethan, oblivious as ever, kept treating me like a joke. He still assumed I was too naive to understand the situation. That's when I played my first real card. At the next meeting, I sat across from them, smiled, and said I was ready to invest, but under one condition. I wanted a major stake in the company. For the first time, they hesitated. Ethan scoffed but didn't outright refuse. He still believed he was in control, assuming I was too naive to know what I was asking for. My parents, blinded by desperation, convinced him it was just a technicality, they'd manipulate me later. After a long silence, they agreed, thinking they had outsmarted me. They had no idea they had just sealed their own downfall. They thought they could manipulate me later. They had no idea what they had just done. The moment the paperwork was signed, everything changed. I was no longer just Ethan's dumb little sister who didn't understand business. I was now a major shareholder, legally entitled to review financials, approve decisions, and, most importantly, make changes. Ethan barely paid attention when I took my seat at the table, still convinced I was just playing pretend. My parents looked relieved, thinking I was finally stepping in to help the family. None of them realized they had just handed me the power to destroy them. I wasted no time. The next day, I hired an external auditor, someone with no connections to my family, someone who would go through every financial record with a fine-tooth comb. As expected, red flags started popping up everywhere. Unreported debts, falsified profit margins, missing funds that had been funneled into Ethan's personal spending. By the time the first audit report came in, Ethan had started to realize something was off. He tried to play it cool, brushing off concerns in meetings, making up excuses for accounting errors, but behind the scenes, he was scrambling. Documents were being shredded, emails were being deleted. It didn't matter. The damage was done. Word got out fast. Investors who had already been uneasy started pulling out. Suppliers stopped offering extensions. Employees whispered in break rooms. The cracks in Ethan's empire weren't just showing, they were widening by the second. To control the narrative, I made my next move. I arranged a formal company statement, positioning myself as the one working to save the business. I didn't mention Ethan by name, but the message was clear. Under new management, things would improve. The employees, who had been mistreated by Ethan for years, took notice. Meetings started running smoother. Payroll became a priority again. I made it clear that incompetence wouldn't be tolerated anymore. The shift in loyalty was almost instant. Ethan, realizing that people were starting to side with me, tried to assert control. He called for an emergency restructuring, attempting to strip my decision-making power. But he had made one crucial mistake. He had already signed over shares. He couldn't override me. Then, the legal problems started rolling in. The fraud Daniel and I uncovered wasn't just internal mismanagement, it was serious. Investors who had been misled started filing complaints. The bank, now fully aware of the situation, moved forward with repossessing our parents' house. That's when the desperation hit. My parents, who had spent years treating me like an afterthought, were now scrambling. The moment their credit cards stopped working, the moment the foreclosure notices arrived, they panicked. Not because they realized they had been wrong, but because they had finally run out of ways to ignore reality. And now they wanted me to clean up their mess. It wasn't even phrased like a request. You need to fix this. You're part of this family. You owe us. Even in crisis, they couldn't bring themselves to treat me as an equal. I pretended to be conflicted. I let them believe I was struggling with the decision, that I was considering stepping in to save them. All the while, I was finalizing my revenge. Ethan, in one last desperate move, decided to fight back. He filed a lawsuit against me, claiming that I had misrepresented the nature of the investment and pressured him into signing away company shares. In his arrogance, he assumed the court would sympathize with him, not realizing that doing so would require opening the company's financial records that would expose the full extent of his fraud. It was a fatal miscalculation. It was a mistake. The lawsuit meant financial records had to be examined. Every document, every signature, every transaction Ethan had tried to hide side was now in the hands of legal professionals. When the court saw what was really going on, they dismissed his case so fast it was almost embarrassing. Instead of saving him, the lawsuit exposed him. Now, there was no denying it, he had been committing fraud. The fallout was immediate. The last remaining investors pulled out. Creditors came knocking. The company's stock plummeted. Employees who had stayed loyal to him finally saw the truth. And then, the eviction notice arrived. My parents, still clinging to the belief that things would somehow turn around, were forced to face reality. The bank was taking the house. They had no savings left. Ethan had burned through everything. For the first time, they understood what was happening. And for the first time, they turned to me with real fear in their eyes. I could have stopped it. I could have stepped in, paid off their debts, saved the business, let them keep their home. But I didn't. They had made their choices. Now, they had to live with them. The fallout from Ethan's lawsuit was fast and brutal. Investors backed out, suppliers cut ties, and the remaining employees started looking for a way out. The company's name was now tied to fraud and mismanagement, and no one wanted to be the last one holding the bag. Ethan snapped. At the office, he had a full-blown meltdown in front of everyone. He screamed at the staff, accused them of being ungrateful, and went on a rant about how I was the reason everything was collapsing. He was used to being untouchable, used to people bending over backward to clean up his messes. Now, there was no one left to save him. It was time to finish what I started. I called for an emergency board meeting. As a major shareholder, I had the right to demand a vote on Ethan's leadership. It wasn't even a debate. Every remaining board member had seen the financial disaster he created. The vote was unanimous. Ethan was officially removed from the company. He tried to fight it. He tried arguing, threatening, even throwing out some last-minute promises to turn things around. But it was too late. His name was already toxic, and no one was willing to go down with him. The second he lost his position, everything started crumbling around him. The banks, already wary of his financial situation, wasted no time. His car was repossessed in the middle of the day, right outside the office. Employees watched as a tow truck hauled away his luxury SUV, one of many expensive toys he had bought on credit. Instead of taking responsibility, he did what he always did. He blamed me. The smear campaign started immediately. Ethan called every extended family member, spinning the story in his favor. In his version, I was the one who had manipulated my way into the company. I had stolen from the family. I was the reason our parents were struggling. My parents predictably took his side. They told everyone that I was a traitor, that I had abandoned my own family just when they needed me most. They left out the part where they had rewritten the will to give Ethan everything. They left out the part where he had gambled away the company's future. At first, I ignored it. I knew how my family worked. They thought if they spread the right rumors, they could guilt me into giving in. But karma worked faster than expected. Ethan's landlord, seeing the financial chaos surrounding him, decided to cut his losses. With no job, no income, and no access to quick cash, Ethan struggled to make rent. His landlord, already aware of his financial troubles, refused to grant an extension. With eviction looming, Ethan tried stalling with fake promises of a business deal that never materialized. Eventually, he had no choice. He packed up what little he had left and moved out in disgrace. And his credit? It tanked. By now, I had enough. I wasn't just going to sit back and let him drag me down with him. I called my lawyer and filed a formal fraud complaint against him. Not only did this protect me legally, but it also forced an even deeper investigation into his actions. Now, it wasn't just the investors watching him, it was law enforcement. That's when my parents showed up at my doorstep. They were desperate. No more passive-aggressive guilt trips. No more offhand comments about helping family. They stood there, pleading, begging me to let Ethan back into the company, to give him another chance. They still believed he could be saved. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I just told them, you made your choice. Now live with it. Then I shut the door in their faces. The tide started turning. Extended family who had originally bought into Ethan's sob story began changing their tune. The lawsuit had backfired. His fraud was now public record. His eviction wasn't just gossip, it was proof that he had failed. Then, in a final act of desperation, Ethan tried to pull off one last scheme. He attempted to illegally sell off company assets, furniture, equipment, anything he could get his hands on, to cover his debts. He figured since he had always been in charge, no one would stop him. But I had already locked down all major transactions. His attempted sale was blocked immediately, and word got out that he had tried to cash out before everything crashed. If there was any last bit of credibility he had left, it was gone. The lawsuit he had filed against me was officially thrown out, and with that, his last hope of clawing his way back into power disappeared. It was time to make it official. I released a public statement announcing that the company was restructuring under new leadership. No direct mention of Ethan, no drama, just a professional, clean break from the disaster he had created. Investors, seeing that he was no longer involved, started cautiously re-engaging. Employees who had been uncertain now saw a future without Ethan running things into the ground. Meanwhile, Ethan was completely cut off. No home, no job, no money, and officially blacklisted in business circles. He had nothing left. And I wasn't done yet. Even after Ethan lost everything, my parents still refused to see reality. They believed, without a doubt, that he would somehow bounce back, that he would fix this, that he would rebuild his reputation. It was just a rough patch. They convinced themselves that if they just supported him a little longer, he would be back on top. And to them, I was the reason he was struggling. They told anyone who would listen that I had betrayed the family, that I had taken advantage of Ethan when he was at his lowest, that I had turned on them on my own blood when they needed me most. But none of that mattered, because now I had full control. With Ethan out, I made my next move, a complete restructuring of the company. And that included removing every single person who had enabled him. That meant my parents. For decades, they had treated the company like a personal personal ATM, draining it without a second thought. They assumed they would have control for life, that no matter what happened, they would always have access to company funds. Not anymore. The day the paperwork was finalized, they were officially stripped of all decision-making power. Their names were removed from every financial account, every board position, every single piece of influence they had clung to. They were furious. They demanded meetings. They called, they emailed, they even tried to storm into the office, but security turned them away. And then, the real consequences hit. Without access to company money, their spending came to a sudden halt. The unpaid luxury purchases, the designer clothes, the expensive dinners, the weekend getaways started piling up. Creditors, who had previously been patient because of the family name, now wanted payment immediately. And worst of all, their house, the one they had always bragged about, the one they had put up as collateral for Ethan's loans, was about to be foreclosed on. They hadn't made a mortgage payment in months, assuming I would step in and take care of it, assuming I would bail them out. Now, the bank was taking action. That's when the calls started pouring in. First, it was my mother, acting like nothing had happened. She brought up childhood memories, tried to guilt-trip me, talking about family bonds and how no matter what, we were supposed to stand by each other. Then my father, taking a different approach. He tried to lecture me, saying I was being short-sighted and that one day, I'd regret turning my back on my own blood. When neither of those worked, they escalated. Extended family members started calling, some trying to shame me, others acting as if they were neutral parties, just hoping I would do the right thing. It was obvious my parents had gone to them, spinning the same sob story they had been telling everyone else. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I just reminded them my parents had never supported me, not once. And then I hung up. The fallout was fast. Word spread quickly within their social circle. Suddenly, people who once admired them, the ones who had envied their wealth, their lifestyle, saw them for what they really were, failures. And nobody wanted to be associated with them anymore. Then came my final move. As the bank prepared to auction off their house, I worked through a third-party investor to place a bid, ensuring my name wouldn't appear on any documents they would see. The purchase went through quietly, hidden behind layers of legal formalities. They only found out the truth when they tried to negotiate with the new owner and realized they were talking to me. The realization hit them like a ton of bricks. They were homeless, and the person who now owned their former home, me, they begged, pleaded, offered to forgive everything if I would just let them move back in. My mother swore she had never meant the things she said. My father promised they had learned their lesson. I refused. Instead, I rented it out to another family, and my parents were forced to watch strangers live in the house they had once ruled over. Meanwhile, Ethan continued his downward spiral. At first, he tried couch surfing with friends, but word had already spread he was a financial disaster, the kind of person who would take and take until there was nothing left. One by one, people cut him off. And then, my parents did something I knew was coming. They showed up at my door. This was their last move, their final chance to convince me to forgive and forget. My father swallowed his pride, my mother forced a smile, both of them acting as if everything could still be fixed. But there was nothing left to fix. They had made it clear my entire life that I was never good enough for them, that I was second place to Ethan, that my success didn't matter, that I would never be their first choice. Now, they needed me. And I walked away. For the first time in my life, I was truly free. With Ethan and my parents completely out of the picture, I turned my full attention to the company. For years, they had run it like a personal cash machine, bleeding it dry, ignoring its potential, and treating employees like disposable workers. Now, with no more reckless spending, no more fraud, and no more entitled management, I had the chance to rebuild it the way it should have been all along. The first thing I did was clean house. Every single person who had been complicit in Ethan's mess, his yes men, his enablers, the ones who looked the other way while he stole from the company, were fired. Some tried to fight back, others tried to guilt-trip me into keeping them on, but I didn't entertain it. They were out. Then I focused on the employees who had been loyal, the ones who had stuck it out despite Ethan's mismanagement, the ones who had been ignored and overworked. I met with them, listened to their concerns, and restructured the company from the ground up. Better leadership, smarter investments, actual financial accountability. And within a year, the company was thriving. Profits hit record highs. The business that Ethan had nearly run into the ground was now more successful than ever. Investors returned, partnerships strengthened, and the company's reputation, once tainted by Ethan's failures, was now seen as a powerhouse. Employees, once overworked and underpaid, now had stability and real leadership. And they knew it. They openly celebrated the changes, some even going as far as to say that Ethan being removed was the best thing to ever happen to the company. Meanwhile, Ethan was burning every bridge. He tried finding work in the industry, but no one wanted to hire him. His reputation was ruined. Too many people had seen what he had done to our company, and no one wanted to take that risk. At first, he refused to accept reality. He still carried himself like the same arrogant golden boy, assuming that if he just found the right opportunity, everything would go back to the way it was. But the job offers never came. The few friends who had supported him slowly started distancing themselves. He burned through whatever little money he had left, and with no income, his options dried up fast. My parents weren't doing much better. For the first time in their lives, they had to live without luxury. No more house, no more business funds, no more easy money. They were forced to downsize, moving into a small, modest apartment, cutting out all the luxuries they had once bragged about. They had never had to live within their means before, and the adjustment was brutal. Then, the apologies started rolling in. Extended family members, the same ones who had taken Ethan's side, who had called me a traitor for not bailing him out, began reaching out. They had seen the truth. They had watched Ethan self-destruct. They had watched my parents make excuse after excuse. And they had watched me take a dying business and turn it into a success. Some apologized outright. Others tried to reconnect subtly, as if they had never taken a side. I didn't hold grudges, but I wasn't naive. I forgave some, but I never let them close again. Then Ethan made one last embarrassing attempt at clawing his way back. Desperate to prove he was still business-minded, he tried starting his own company. He had no funding, no business knowledge, no investors willing to back him. But he pushed forward anyway, convinced that if I could do it, he could do it better. It crashed within months. The failure was so public, so humiliating, that even business circles started mocking it. The very people who had once praised him were now laughing laughing at him. And for the first time, my parents realized they had bet on the wrong child. They had spent years pushing me aside, treating me like an afterthought while Ethan wasted everything they had given him. Now, I was the one who had built something. I was the one succeeding. And Ethan? He was a nobody. With no job, no business, no reputation, and no family support left, he completely disappeared from their social circles. And I was free. I had the company. I had success. I had built my own life without them. One day, I ran into an old family friend, someone who had once been close with my parents, someone who had heard everything over the years. They mentioned that my parents regretted everything, that they now saw their mistakes, that they wished they had done things differently. They asked if it was too late for them to fix things. I just smiled and walked away because I had already built a life without them, and I wouldn't change a thing. Ethan had lost everything, his job, his reputation, his apartment, and any shred of credibility he once had. But he wasn't done trying to drag me down with him. Desperate, he made one last attempt at salvaging his mess. He tried to blackmail me. Through a mutual contact, he claimed he had evidence that I had manipulated my way into power, that I had tricked him into signing away his shares, that I had orchestrated the entire downfall of the family business. The threat was laughable. I hadn't done anything illegal, just been smarter than him. Every contract was legally binding, every transaction had been above board, and every move I made had been backed by solid business decisions. Instead of engaging, I had my lawyer send him a cease and desist letter. The message was clear: any false claims would result in a defamation lawsuit. Ethan, realizing he had no real leverage, went quiet for about a week. Then, his next embarrassing stunt surfaced. He started a GoFundMe. The title? Victim of Corporate Sabotage, Help Me Rebuild My Life. In his sob story, he painted himself as a hardworking businessman who had been betrayed by his own sister, stripped of everything, and left with no way to start over. He begged for donations, claiming he just needed a little help to get back on his feet. No one donated. People mocked him. Old business associates, former employees, even distant acquaintances started commenting, calling him out for ruining his own life. Screenshots of his luxury vacations, his reckless spending, and the fraud he committed were reposted in the comments. The fundraiser was up for a few days before he deleted it in humiliation. With no money, he tried applying for corporate jobs. No company wanted him. His resume was a disaster, his reputation even worse. No one was going to hire a man who had been publicly ousted from his own family's business due to fraud. Every interview ended the same way: rejection after rejection. Meanwhile, my parents had been holding on to the last bit of hope that Ethan would somehow turn things around. But watching him fail over and over again finally made something click for them. For the first time, they realized they had bet on the wrong child. And just like Ethan, they turned to the only option they had left: me. They showed up at my office. Not unannounced, I had security instructions to keep them from causing a scene, but they requested a meeting. I agreed. Not because I wanted to help them, but because I wanted to help them. But because I wanted to see exactly how far they had fallen. They were polite. Too polite. For the first time in my life, they weren't speaking to me with condescension. They asked me for jobs. My own parents, who had spent years dismissing me, belittling me, and treating me like I was nothing, were now asking me to hire them. I didn't hesitate. I told them I only hire people who take responsibility for their failures. They tried to convince me. They apologized. They said they finally understood my value, that they had been wrong, that they regretted everything. But I could see right through them. They didn't respect me. They needed me. And now that they had nothing left, they thought they could rewrite history. I told them to leave and never come back. Without my help, they had no options left. The last thing I heard, they had moved into a tiny apartment, far from the luxury they had once bragged about. And Ethan? With no job, no money, no home, and no family support left, he disappeared. Social media? Gone. Connections? Burned. No one knew where he went. And honestly, I didn't care. Ethan had already lost everything. His job, his home, his connections. But just when I thought he couldn't fall any further, his past came back to destroy whatever was left of his reputation. One of his former business partners, someone he had screwed over years ago, decided it was time for payback. Financial records, leaked emails, proof of how Ethan had manipulated numbers, faked profitability, and scammed investors into believing the company was thriving when it was on the verge of collapse. It didn't take long for the story to spread. At first, it stayed within industry circles, business professionals passing it around as a cautionary tale, but then a financial news outlet picked it up. And just like that, Ethan became a joke. People in the business world started mocking him publicly. His name was used as an example of what not to do. Memes were made, jokes were shared, and even former colleagues joined in, confirming just how reckless and incompetent he had been. And then, more people started coming forward. Former employees shared horror stories of how he had treated them: unpaid wages, verbal abuse, blatant favoritism. Ex-girlfriends, once silent, began exposing his past behavior: cheating, lies, manipulation. Even distant relatives who had cut him off years ago started speaking up, talking about how he had borrowed money and never paid it back, how he had always expected others to fix his problems. Any hope of rebuilding his name was gone. Meanwhile, my parents, they saw what was happening and panicked. They had spent years propping Ethan up, defending his actions, enabling his behavior. And now that he was a public disaster, they were scrambling to distance themselves. They told people they had no idea what Ethan had been doing, that they never supported his shady business practices, that they were victims of his deception, just like everyone else. Nobody believed them. The community saw right through them. These were the same parents who had handed Ethan everything, who had cut me out of the will, who had insisted that he was the only one capable of running the family business. Now they were paying the price for their blind loyalty. But I wasn't done yet. I wanted to erase every trace of their influence from my life. The family business still carried their name, a name that had been tainted by years of mismanagement. If I wanted to fully move forward, I needed to sever the final tie. So I rebranded. New name, new leadership, a fresh start with zero connection to the mess Ethan and my parents had created. And then I made my final public statement. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't vengeful. It was calm, professional, and brutally efficient. I stated that the company had successfully restructured after overcoming past mismanagement, that we had rebuilt a solid foundation for the future, and that we were moving forward with integrity and accountability. I never mentioned Ethan or my parents by name. I didn't have to. The message was clear: they were gone, and the company was better off without them. Ethan, still desperate to crawl his way back into relevance, made one last attempt to start over. He tried launching his own business. It was a disaster from the start. No investors wanted to touch him. No bank would approve a loan. The moment people heard his name attached to it, they walked away. Within months, it failed. The humiliation was so bad that even the people who had once supported him, his last few remaining allies, finally gave up. Then the final blow came. With no options left, no money, and nowhere to turn, Ethan officially filed for bankruptcy. He had nothing. No savings, no assets, no business. Meanwhile, my parents, their social standing was completely destroyed. They weren't just struggling financially, they were shunned. The same people they used to impress, the ones they had flaunted their wealth in front of, now wanted nothing to do with them. They lost everything: the house, the connections, the reputation they had built over years of looking down on others. And then in one last desperate move, they reached out to me. For the first time, they admitted they missed me. They didn't beg for money, didn't ask for help. They just said they regretted everything. I sent them one final message: you made your choices, now live with them. And then, I blocked them forever. No second chances, no apologies. I had built a life without them, and I never looked back. Years passed, and Ethan remained exactly where he had left himself, at the bottom. He bounced from one failed scheme to another, desperately trying to regain the status he once had. And every few months, I'd hear about his latest attempt: a new business, a new hustle, some new big idea that was supposed to make him rich again. Every single one of them crashed. Investors still refused to touch him. Nobody in the business world wanted anything to do with him. He had burned too many bridges, ruined too many opportunities. With no steady income, he floated from place to place, relying on the few acquaintances who still pitied him enough to let him crash on their couches. And my parents? They had become ghosts. The people they once called friends, the ones they had flaunted their wealth to, the ones they had used to look down on others, had all moved on without them. They weren't invited to parties. They weren't part of any social gatherings. Nobody cared about them anymore. With no money, no influence, and no one left to impress, they faded into the background, forgotten by the very people they had once tried so hard to impress. Meanwhile, my life became everything they said I could never have. I bought my dream home, a place that was mine alone, free from their shadows. I traveled, experiencing the world in ways they never thought I would. I built a circle of genuine friends, people who cared about me, not about money or status. And the company, it flourished. Without their greed and incompetence holding it back, it grew stronger every year. Profits soared, partnerships thrived, and the employees, once miserable under Ethan's rule, flourished in a work environment that actually valued them. It became clear to everyone that the only thing truly holding the company back had been them. And despite everything, Ethan never changed. Occasionally, I'd hear from mutual contacts that he was still bitter, still trying to convince people that I had stolen from him, that I had ruined his life. But no one listened. Nobody cared about the opinion of a man who had lost everything by his own hand. And then, finally, my parents understood. I heard through distant relatives that, in their quiet moments, they admitted it. They had chosen the wrong child. They had spent their entire lives betting on Ethan, sacrificing everything to support him, and in the end, he had nothing to show for it. And I had everything. But by the time they realized their mistake, it didn't matter anymore. I no longer cared. The weight of their existence, of their judgments, of their expectations, it was all gone. I was free. They had destroyed themselves. I had never needed to seek revenge. I had never needed to ruin them. They had done it all on their own, and I never let them back in. Even when I knew they regretted everything, even when I knew they missed me, I never reached out. I never answered their messages. I never gave them a second chance. Instead, I built a life without them. A real family, one built on love and support, not greed and favoritism. And then, one day it happened. I ran into my father. It was at a store, an ordinary day, an ordinary moment. But as soon as I saw him, I knew. He looked old. Not just in age, but in spirit. He was a man who had lost everything, and had finally realized that nothing was coming to save him. His face lit up when he saw me, as if he thought, for just a second, that maybe this was his chance. He opened his mouth to speak. I didn't stop. I didn't stop. I didn't acknowledge him. I just walked past him, without a word, without a glance. I didn't need closure. I didn't need validation. I had already won. I was never the dumb one. I was just smarter than all of them.